Welcome to Smarty Plants, a Minnesota Department of Agriculture podcast, informing citizens about invasive species that affect our environment and agricultural resources. My name is Jennifer Barrington, and I will be your host. As Minnesotans, we pride ourselves on our trees, and we are lucky to have such a large variety, including junipers, crabapples, and apple trees. In 2022, red star rust, an invasive plant pathogen, was found for the first time in Minnesota. Red star rust could be a particularly concerning problem for our apple trees. Michelle Grabowski and Tiffany Enzenbacher are here to discuss this new plant pathogen and to tell us about ongoing research and how to manage the disease in nurseries, orchards, and home landscapes. Michelle is a plant pathologist with the MDA's Plant Protection Division. Her work focuses on prevention and early detection of invasive plant pathogens that threaten crops and native plant communities in Minnesota.
Happy to be here.
And Tiffany is a researcher in the Department of Horticultural Science at the University of Minnesota in Dr. Brandon Miller's lab. She is working on several projects related to red star rust, which you'll hear about during this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started talking about red star rust, Tiffany, can you tell us a little bit about the importance of apples and crabapples grown here in Minnesota?
Well, due to Minnesota's low winter temperatures, breeding cold, hardy apple trees has been at the forefront of the state's and the University of Minnesota's priorities. The 1991 University of Minnesota release Honeycrisp has actually risen among the top 4 apple fruit grown in the U.S. Sweet Tango is another popular university variety, and Triumph and Kudos are newer releases. In 2022, the value of U.S. apple production was just over $3 billion, with sales specific to Minnesota at over $20 million in 2017. And as far as crabapples, they are grown here in Minnesota because of their spring flowers, their fall fruit, various tree forms, suitability to most landscapes, and most importantly for us, cold tolerance. Minnesota is actually the second highest producer of crabapples in the U.S., with sales here at just over $3 million in 2019.
And then, Michelle, could you remind us what a plant pathogen is?
So it's important to realize that plants get sick too. So a plant pathogen is an organism that causes a disease in a plant. And when we're talking about plant pathogens, quite frequently it's a fungi, but there's also bacteria and viruses and other microorganisms that can cause a plant to be sick.
So red star rust is one plant pathogen. So what type causes red star rust, and how can it affect tree health?
So red star rust is caused by a fungus, Gymnosporangium yamadae. It's essentially the counterpart of our native North American cedar apple rust. Red star rust is also similar to other rusts that affect apple, like hawthorn and quince rusts. As we talked about earlier, red star rust affects apples, crabapple, and some species of landscape juniper. The reported juniper hosts include Chinese juniper, Sargent's juniper, flaky juniper, garden juniper, and Pittsford juniper. And as far as how can it affect tree health, for apple and crabapple, red star rust may cause early defoliation or leaf drop, which reduces the health and vigor of the plant. And this may affect yield, which we'd be concerned about for apple. And of course, the flower and fruit display for crabapple, and actual fruit infection is possible. As far as juniper, we wouldn't expect any significant permanent damage. And the thing to remember with rusts is that they're obligate pathogens, which means they require living tissue in order to complete their own life cycle. And because of that, they need to grow on live plant tissue, so we wouldn't anticipate plant death.
So this seems like a really new plant pathogen to our state. Michelle, could you talk a little bit about when we first learned about it in Minnesota?
Sure. So red star rust is, as Tiffany mentioned, a fungal plant pathogen, and it was actually first described in Japan in 1904. It's known to occur in a couple different countries in Asia. And it was first identified in the United States in 2009 on the East Coast, so in Delaware and Pennsylvania. And once researchers started looking for it, it was found widely throughout the eastern states. But at that time, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and other Midwestern states looked for the pathogen here in our apple-producing areas, and we didn't find it. Then in 2021, Wisconsin reported finding the red star rust in nurseries on crabapple trees. And so Minnesota, realizing that this pathogen was now closer to home, started looking here as well in apple orchards as well as in nurseries and landscapes. And in 2022, we found it. And we found it in all of the 7 metro counties, as well as Rice County, LeSueur County, and McLeod County. And we were able to find it in apple orchards. We found it on nursery trees, and we even found it in some landscape trees. So we found it in a couple of different places where it was out there causing disease, but it doesn't seem to have spread very far beyond those metro counties and a few counties out from there.
So I have a backyard crabapple tree, and my neighbors have a couple apple trees that they have recently planted. What does red star rust look like, the symptoms on crabapples and apple trees versus what's in juniper?
Yeah, so on apples and crabapples, we see very large, irregularly shaped lesions on leaves. And by irregularly shaped, I mean they're not perfectly circular. The lesions sometimes have a starburst shape, hence the name red star rust. So red star rust is also known as Japanese apple rust. However, the literal Japanese translation is red star rust. So for accuracy's sake, we go for red star rust for the common name of the disease. And these lesions or spots are typically brightly colored in shades of yellow, orange, or red. This is really dependent on the cultivar. So typically, white-flowered plants usually have yellow lesions or lighter lesions, and then red or pink-flowered plants tend to have darker lesions or red lesions. And these spots or lesions are usually always bordered by a red color. And then in late summer, typically July into August, we see bristly spore structures develop on the underside of the leaf. It almost looks like toothbrush bristles. And on juniper, red star rust causes very small galls or a proliferation of tissue. And when I say small, I mean very small. They're just about 1/4 of an inch, about the size of a pea. And they're woody and brown, and they camouflage very well with the juniper branch and virtually undetectable until early spring. And in spring, coinciding with warm temperatures and rain, these galls are signaled to germinate or sporulate. They release these bright orange, very noticeable gelatinous spore masses. And we can think of spores as the reproductive units of fungi. So basically, they're fungal seeds that cause disease. And these spores on the juniper look like someone flung orange jello at the plant. They're very noticeable, and they contrast very well with the green foliage of the juniper plant.
Yeah, I've noticed in the past, I've seen some like cedar apple rust, like you guys talked about. There's some other common rusts that happen on crabapples and junipers and stuff. So I've seen that, and it's very bright orange. Like you can see it from a good distance away when they have those bright gelatinous, just like you said, looks like Jell-O. So to go a little bit more with the life cycle and like how it looks different on these different plants, but what is the life cycle of red star rust and how does it spread? Michelle, if you want to take a shot at this.
Sure. So the important thing with the rusts like red star rust is they need both plants to complete their life cycle. So the spores from the juniper, when those gelatinous orange spore masses get formed in early spring, they get splashed by rain onto the nearby crabapple or apple trees. And they create a different type of spore structure on the apple. So it moves from the juniper to the apple, and then late in the season, those bristle brush structures that Tiffany was describing, if you touch them, sometimes you'll see a powdery, almost brick red type spores coming out of it, and those spores will get carried by the wind back to the juniper. So if one of those two plants is not present, then the rust isn't able to complete its life cycle. It needs to go from the crabapple or the apple to the juniper, and then the juniper back to the crabapple.
Perfect. So I mentioned I've seen cedar apple rust and stuff, and this is red star rust. It's different. So why is this plant pathogen distinct from the other native species that we have?
For apple and crabapple, red star rust lesions tend to be larger than cedar apple rust and also irregularly shaped. And we can expect our native cedar apple rust to have more circular lesions, and the lesions may also be smaller on that leaf. And if you turn the leaf over, those bristly spore structures are actually diagnostic. So if you have a small hand lens, or you could even zoom in with your smartphone camera, you can see that the red star rust bristles look different from the cedar apple rust. So the fungal structures for red star rust are long and tapered, and cedar apple rust bristles are curved in different directions and radiate outward from the center. And the bristles even look fuzzy without even using a hand lens. And for juniper, currently the red star rust host range does not include our native eastern red cedar or other North American species that we can grow in Minnesota, creeping juniper, common juniper, or Rocky Mountain juniper. So this is one way to distinguish between the two. The second way to distinguish cedar apple rust from red star rust is the size of the gall. Red star rust galls are very small, again, about the size of a pea or just 1/4 of an inch in diameter. And cedar apple rust galls can be quite large, 1.5 to 2 inches. And a third giveaway is the size and shape of those orange structures that protrude out of the gall. They're called horns. Red star rust has broad, flat, short horns, whereas cedar apple rusts are pointed and long.
And the cedar apple rust galls, because they're so big and then those gelatinous orange spore structures are really long, they're very dramatic and noticeable. We do see them quite frequently, and I remember getting phone calls and questions about, orange aliens that had landed in people's tree or these weird tentacled octopus type things. So they're very dramatic looking. Whereas I think Tiffany's description of jello splats in your juniper is a better description for the red star rust. I'd also wanted to point out that one of the reasons we are interested in looking more into red star rust is we know that many of the apples grown here in Minnesota and crab apples have pretty decent resistance to cedar apple rust. So we may see spores. We don't see a lot of leaf drop. But we're not sure how our native varieties or our cold hardy varieties we're not sure how our cold hardy cultivars of apples and crab apples will respond to red star rust. In some of the original research work that was done in Japan and other Asian countries, there were apple trees that had some resistance and were able to tolerate the infection. There were also apple trees that when they became infected, they lost a significant amount of their leaves. And this resulted in lower fruit yields and the trees struggling to be productive. And because the red star rust is a new disease here to Minnesota, we don't know how Minnesota's trees are going to react to this new fungal plant pathogen.
Since red star rust is so new to Minnesota, Tiffany, what research are you doing to learn more about this plant pathogen?
Yeah, we have multiple red star rust investigations underway with the ultimate goal of creating best management practices for the nursery and fruit industries here in Minnesota. And this is a joint project between the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the University of Minnesota. The first investigation that we're undertaking is scouting. So scouting is a systematic way to inspect plants for disease. And we're doing this to see what cultivars are susceptible in a field situation. We scouted in 2024, and we'll look at the same plants again this growing season. And we're doing this scouting work at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum in Chaska, which is in Carver County. And if you aren't familiar with the Arboretum, it's a 1,200-acre public garden focused on education, conservation, and research. We chose this location because it does have so many juniper and crabapple specimens. There are actually 45 reported juniper hosts at the Arboretum. We mapped them out and developed a route to scout them all. We began scouting in April 2024 as the temperature started to warm up and as the rain began. And we continued through the end of May. And as you probably remember, there was plenty of rain last spring, which meant we were out scouting quite a bit. We collected dozens of galls and branch samples. We would take a photo of each gall, put it in a paper bag, and then we submitted it for identification to a lab to confirm that it was indeed red star rust. So out of the dozens of samples, one gall came back positive for red star rust, and it was found on a Chinese juniper. And in the summer, we spent days and days at the Arboretum scouting all the crabapples because there are so many, over 500. We visited every single crabapple tree from mid-July into August, looking for those very characteristic red star rust lesions on the leaves. Large trees could take up to 5 minutes to scout, and small ones may just take a minute. And over 75% of all the crabapples at the Arboretum ended up having red star rust. We were surprised at the results just because red star rust was just found in Carver County in 2022. And we also observed fruit infection for the first time, to our knowledge, in the U.S. on 2 plants at the northern edge of the Arboretum. And then we'll be out scouting again in 2025, so we'll have 2 full years of data.
So what about junipers? Is there anything that can be done to manage red star rust on junipers?
Yeah, so we are working on determining which fungicides are effective in preventing galls from forming on junipers. We're testing several different fungicides on susceptible juniper species. We started our foliar fungicide applications in July when we could see apples in the surrounding orchards of the Horticulture Research Center forming those bristly spore structures on the undersides of their leaves. And the Horticulture Research Center is a research and outreach center in Excelsior with a lot of different apple research. And we treated the junipers at 2-week intervals until frost. And to hedge our bets, just in case natural infection wasn't enough from the nearby orchards, we actually made a spore suspension. So we mixed spores with water collected from red star rust infected apple leaves and sprayed that on junipers. So it actually takes 20 to 22 months for the galls on junipers to fully mature and release those orange jello-like spore masses. So we will evaluate the junipers in spring 2026. And at that point, we'll look at several branches from each juniper plant and note how many galls are present to determine which fungicide is most effective.
So is there any other information about how red star rust will act in Minnesota that growers need to know, especially for like junipers? And there are a lot of people that do grow crabapple and apple trees.
Yeah, we're interested in finding out when the most red star rust spores are out in the environment, both in spring from junipers and in late summer from apple and crabapple, to better time fungicide spray programs for growers. And we're doing this by spore trapping. So how do we actually trap the spores? We have 3 windsock spore traps out at the Arboretum and the Associated Horticulture Research Center. And these windsocks are exactly the same ones that you might see at an airport to determine wind direction. And then how do we physically trap the red star rust spores? There are small clips attached to the inside frame of the windsock, and these clips hold microscope slides, which are coated with a very gooey petroleum jelly. So when we place the slides and the clips on the windsocks, any spore, particle of soil, pollen grain, or insect gets stuck to the petroleum jelly. And then we have a protocol in the lab to confirm the presence and the quantity of red star rust spores. We're working on this lab portion now with our 2024 season slides, and we'll trap spores again in 2025, and we'll have 2 years of data to compare.
So there are a lot of junipers planted in landscapes around houses, and then there's a lot of, like I mentioned, crabapple trees and apple trees around in the neighborhoods. So who should be worrying about red star rust, and what management practices are recommended?
So red star rust can affect several different groups of plant growers here in Minnesota. We have our apple growers who have orchards and they're raising apple trees for fruit to be sold at market. We also have nurseries, which may be raising crabapple trees, apple trees to be sold to home gardens or other landscape settings, as well as raising junipers. And then we have home gardeners and people that are caring for trees that are already in their landscape. And again, that may include apple trees, crabapple trees, and juniper trees. What we're seeing right now in apple orchards as well as in home landscapes and other settings, homes, gardens, and parks, we're seeing red star rust present, but not at levels that would hurt the tree. So although it's present, there's really no management action that is necessary in landscapes at this time for home gardeners to take if they do see red star rust. Probably the biggest group that needs to be focused on managing red star rust at this time are nurseries here in Minnesota that are producing crabapple and apple trees for sale, as well as juniper plants for sale. And that's because here in Minnesota, we do have a nursery statute that plants that are being sold, perennial plants, need to be free of pests and pathogens before they're able to be sold. And so what we are recommending for nurseries right now is that they do use fungicides to protect apple and crabapple trees in the spring when those galls may be sporulating on the junipers. So that's coming up soon because we want to make sure those fungicides are there to protect those apples and crabapple trees before they're offered for sale. So anything that you go to a garden center or a nursery to buy this year is healthy and disease-free, and we're not going to be moving it to new areas of the state or outside of the state. We do know that the fungicide sprays that are used for cedar apple rust are believed to be effective in protecting our trees against red star rust as well. But we are hoping to update those recommendations with some of the research work Tiffany and her team are doing at the University of Minnesota, because, of course, the environment here in Minnesota is unique to Minnesota, and so we want to make sure our recommendations match the weather conditions that we have here so growers can do the minimum amount of treatments and still end up with healthy plants. We also are really excited about this work going on at the university in protecting the junipers. What's tricky with the junipers is because that infection is hard to see when the galls are formed, and it's in that plant without forming galls for so long. It's very easy to look at a juniper plant and believe that it's healthy and move it or sell it when it could actually be carrying red star rust. So that research is going to be really important in helping our nurseries protect their junipers to make sure the junipers that are going out are healthy. But at this time, we don't have recommendations for that. So the focus right now is really on nurseries protecting their crabapple and apple trees to make sure that they're healthy for sale. For apple orchards and for lawns and landscapes and gardens, it's really more monitoring at this stage and making sure that you are reaching out to the MDA if you do feel that it's moving to a stage that it's harming the health of the tree.
So what should home gardeners do about red star rust if they think they have red star rust?
Well, the first thing we recommend is to start healthy. So if you are buying a new plant at a garden center or nursery, always make sure the plant has no visible symptoms of disease, so you're starting clean. The plant doesn't have any disease spots or stem cankers, doesn't appear stunted, no chlorotic or yellow leaves, no insect pests or evidence of insect feeding, and overall the plant should appear healthy and vigorous. The second recommendation is to not plant reported juniper hosts within a several mile radius of apples. Those junipers, again, are Chinese juniper, sargents, flaky, garden, and Fitzfurs. This, of course, isn't always possible, but ensuring that these junipers are several hundred feet away, or at the very least, you don't have a mix of these junipers with your apple and crab apples in your own home landscape. And in your home landscape, make sure your apples and crab apples are healthy and properly pruned. So if you have a lot of inside branches and water sprouts, the leaves inside may not be drying out, and after a rain event, infection can occur because of that sustained leaf wetness. And if your tree does have a minor red star rust infection, as Michelle indicated, chemical intervention isn't typically necessary. And for juniper, we recommend that you prune off, bag, and discard the galls that you find in spring.
Right. And I think it's important for home gardeners to understand that on an apple or a crabapple tree, we've seen the infection on leaves is the primary source of where we're seeing the disease. As Tiffany mentioned, we've found it on fruit in some cases. But when fall happens and the tree drops all that leaves, that fungus is going to break down as those leaves break down. And so it typically will not survive on the crabapple tree from one season to the next. We are coming up on our spring season as we have warmer, wet days. A home gardener could go out if you have junipers in your landscape. Go out after it's been raining for a couple of hours and closely look at those plants. And you might see either some of our native rusts like the cedar apple rust or the hawthorn rust. You might see something that looks like red star rust. And as Tiffany mentioned, it's pretty easy to clip those off, stick them in a bag to make sure that those spores don't get spread around through the landscape. Once we do reach our warmer, drier summer weather, those galls will naturally dry up and die. But if you find them early in the season, it's not a problem to clip them off. You won't be hurting the juniper, and you can reduce the amount of spores that are spreading to nearby apple and crabapple trees.
Okay, so what should we do if we think we have red star rust? Should we report it in to anybody? Should we contact the university or the MDA?
So at this time, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is monitoring where red star rust is found throughout the state in Minnesota. We know that it occurs in the 7 metro counties as well as Rice, LeSueur, and McLeod County. So if you're finding it and you live in one of those counties, we know that it's there and we don't need it to be reported to us. However, if you are in one of the counties in greater Minnesota, farther from the Twin Cities metro area, and you do see something that you suspect is red star rust, please do take a picture. It's really helpful for us to see either a picture of the gall on the juniper with the sporulation or without, whatever you can get a picture of. If it's on a crabapple or an apple, please take a picture of both sides of the leaf. So if you remember, Tiffany mentioned there's those bristle-like fungal spore-producing structures on the lower surface, and that's one of the things that we look for when we're trying to identify which of the rust we're looking at. So taking a picture of both of those and then reporting it through Report-A-Pest to the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and someone will get back to you about any questions that you have and possible suspects through red star rust on Report-A-Pest.
Yeah, and that Report-A-Pest information is, we have an online form that you can fill out and attach a picture. Just give your name and email address and stuff, and then we also have an email address as well. So the website to get more information on how to report in, if you see some possible red star rust on some crabapple and apple trees or on junipers this spring here, is www.mda.state.mn.us and / and then this is all one word together, Report-A-Pest. And then our email address is, again, one word, reportapest@state.mn.us. And like Michelle mentioned, please attach pictures of what you're seeing. Give us a general idea of the location. And we'll get back to Michelle will probably get back to you. She's the one that usually takes all the plant pathogen questions. Thank you, Michelle and Tiffany, for bringing this issue to our attention. Your work to control this and other plant pathogens is very important for our state's trees and everything that depends on them. This has been Smarty Plants, a podcast from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Our producer is Brittany Ravel, our editor is Larry Schumacher, and I have been your host. You can learn more about pests and other invasive species that affect our environment at www.mda.state.mn.us, and while you head to our website, we'll be working on the next episode of Smarty Plants. See you there.